Okay, so this is really the idea behind what I want to talk about today. Why is it that sexism, misogyny, women's oppression is so resilient? Why is it that we can fight for so long and win so many victories in lots of ways over, you know, a century or more, depending on how you want to measure it, and yet, you know, the most basic things are still women are still having to face today, you know, in terms of control over their own bodies, in terms of the kind of pressures on women about, you know, body image or about what their role should be in society, and so on. And I think in the past couple of years, it has felt in some ways like things have got worse, really. I mean, really, I think the most chilling reminder of the situation that we still face has to be the case of Marsha Jones in the last couple of weeks. I'm sure people will have heard about this. A woman in Alabama who was 5 months pregnant, who was charged with the manslaughter of her unborn child after another person shot her in the stomach. Now, the charges have since been dropped after there was a massive outcry, but the idea that this could even be passed through someone's mind, you know, in the legal system, that someone could be held responsible, you know, for having got into a fight whilst pregnant, you know, that add it to the list of things you're not allowed to do. And of course, Alabama, where she's based, is important because Alabama is where they recently passed state legislation, you know, following on from a whole number of states in America, effectively banning abortion, really with almost no exceptions except for immediate kind of life-threatening risk to the mother. You know, so really it is about this idea that women, once pregnant, are just vessels for the future life and cease to have control, really, over their own bodies and are there to be judged by the whole of the rest of society for their responsibility for a fetus which is entirely dependent on them, really, until it's born. You know, I mean, this is literally the plot of The Handmaid's Tale, isn't it? And, you know, this is the kind of scary situation we have. These are the legislators, just so you get a visual, by the way, are the 22 Alabama legislators who voted against, well, there was 24 or 25, I think, who voted altogether in terms of banning abortion. These are the 22 who voted against even including an exception for people who've been raped or you know, or raped inside the family. And, you know, the stuff about The Handmaid's Tale really has resonated, hasn't it, for a few years. It's a book that's 35 years old, but the TV series, you know, and the existence of Donald Trump in the White House has really brought it back as a symbol. And this was a protest in Ohio, which is another of the states that has passed similar legislation recently. And I think that, yeah, the situation in Alabama is really just one of the logical consequences of this encroaching on women's right to abortion. And really across America, what you're seeing is a whole, you know, number of states where they keep trying to pass these laws. They've not been able since 1973 to really challenge the right to abortion in America on a national scale, but they've been doing it bit by bit in the hope that this can add up to a challenge to the right to abortion in the US. And so in Ohio, where this protest took place, you know, for example, there's an article recently which pointed out there's an 11-year-old girl in Ohio who is pregnant after being raped multiple times by an adult. And under the new law that was passed there in April, she wouldn't be allowed to terminate that pregnancy. Now, as it happens, you know, it's not come into effect yet, so she might be able to if that's what they choose to do. But, you know, under the new legislation, which I should point out is very similar to the legislation in Northern Ireland, much closer to home, part of this nation that we live in, of this state, that there are no exceptions, again, for people who've been raped or you know, for incest and so on. And one of the things that Trump did as soon as he was sworn in, like almost literally the first thing he did in 2017 was to reinstate the thing called the Global Gag Rule, which demands that NGOs that are funded by American aid don't perform or promote abortion around the world. So obviously this is in places where reproductive health is a fantastically important and necessary resource. You know, and a lot of the countries affected, you know, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, have been seriously affected by this. And a report by The Lancet, a medical magazine, pointed out recently that the bizarre thing is that the global gag rule, which had existed in the past, had been repealed by Obama and then brought back by Trump, had actually led probably to more abortions, like 40% more abortions, because the clinics which were providing abortions and which lost their funding were also the clinics that were providing contraception. You know, so there was lots and lots more unwanted pregnancies that then women weren't able to deal with. And I think this reminds us really, you know, because when safe and legal abortion is banned or the access to it is cut off, you don't get abortions not happening, you get dangerous abortions happening, and that's precisely what is taking place, really. And, you know, so these kind of rights, and a lot of the things that I want to talk about today, don't affect all women equally. You know, with abortion, if you've got the money, you can always access a safe abortion because you can pay for a private doctor. And it's actually the women who can't afford to do that who are most affected. And of course, the kind of politicians who are passing this anti-abortion stuff at the moment, and lots of other policies as well, always claim to support the family. They always claim to support, you know, women in bringing up their children and so on. But in reality, 10 years after the economic crisis, the kind of austerity that we've seen here, you know, the similar kind of stuff you've seen in the US, lots of the services that women actually require when they are pregnant or raising a child are being cut. And life as a parent, it gets a lot harder and a lot more dependent on individuals, you know, struggling inside the private home. You know, women are said to have borne 85% of the cost of austerity in Britain, precisely because of their role as the main carers in the family, and, you know, needing those services that are being cut in community services or the benefits that they receive and so on. But also because women work a lot in the public sector, and those are the jobs that are facing pay cuts, pay freezes, underemployment, and all the rest of it. So in lots of different ways, both in terms of women's role directly in the family, but also the way that that role shapes the kind of jobs that women do, you know, they're being hit, you know, in terms of the cutbacks that we've seen in the past decade. One of the things that's been under the spotlight as well recently has been the question of equal pay. You know, one of the big most prominent cases here was around the BBC, you know, the report that came out showing how bad the situation was there, particularly in terms of the top stars. Well, you'll be pleased to hear the BBC announced this week that they're doing loads to rectify this situation by raising the pay of the top stars by 8%. So out of the top 75 stars, highest paid at the BBC, 30 of them are now women, which is their highest ever proportion. So we can all celebrate that Zoe Ball and Claudia Winkleman and whatever are getting paid gross amounts of money alongside their male colleagues. But I think, you know, on a much more widespread level, we see quite a different picture, and we see quite a different picture in terms of how women have fought, really. And this is something, you know, people will, I'm sure, have followed the strike in Glasgow Council over equal pay. And if anyone was at the opening rally of Marxism on Thursday, you'll have seen Lynn Marie, who was one of the strikers involved in this dispute over the end of last year, where they had to fight incredibly hard to actually win equal pay for council workers in the jobs that tend to be done by women. So again, you know, it's like street cleaners, who tend to be men, were getting a better deal from the council than, you know, indoor building cleaners who tend to be women, you know, women who are cleaning in schools and so on. And they had been taking, you know, going to tribunals over this for years. But actually it was when they went out on strike, when they organised and brought the city to a standstill in the autumn of last year, that they won very, very quickly. And they got a deal in February of this year, a package of payments worth £548 million to compensate 16,000 claims, you know, over the question of equal pay. Quite a similar struggle took place just before that in Birmingham, a very long-running one of care workers who I'm sure people know are some of the worst treated in terms of the pay and the kind of conditions they're expected to work in. And mostly women workers in Birmingham have been fighting a long time and have also, you know, managed to fight for an increase in their pay and conditions in the kind of role that is consistently undervalued. And I'll come back to this, really. I think we've seen, because I think we have seen a lot of resistance in the past few years around all kinds of issues that affect women disproportionately. You know, as soon as Trump got elected, 5 million women came out in the marches across the US and across the world, protesting at his, you know, really everything he represents. I mean, he's like, alongside Harvey Weinstein, he's the poster boy for the Me Too movement, really, because of the kind of what he represents and his attitudes that he brazenly still comes out with. We've seen, you know, and we've seen the rise of the right more generally, Bolsonaro in Brazil, you know, in Poland, in Hungary, and so on. You know, these kind of far-right and fascist politicians whose misogyny and sexism really goes hand in hand with their racism and their anti-migrant policies and, you know, the kind of brutal attacks on working class people from all kinds of directions. In Poland, when they tried to ban abortion in 2016, there was a huge women's strike. You know, there was like something like 100,000 people came out protesting, striking on the day. You know, pushed it back for a while, although the issue has come back again more recently in Poland. You know, we've seen similar one-day kind of strikes, protests and so on in Greece, in Spain, 5 million women in the Spanish state last year, Argentina. Last month in Switzerland, 500,000 people, mostly women, took part in strikes, protests, symbolic protests, you know, whatever they could do on the day, on the 14th of June, demanding equal pay, demanding equal pensions, you know, defending public services, but also with slogans about sexual harassment and violence, against homophobia and transphobia. You know, these are some of the women on the protest in Switzerland on the day. You know, it was a huge, huge thing, and it was commemorating an earlier similar women's strike in 1991. And they also, one of their slogans was in solidarity with migrant women, which I think has been a really important part of a lot of the spotlight that has been thrown on things by Donald Trump and in the European Union. You know, the question of how migration and the kind of hostile environments and the zero tolerance policies and so on affect families and affect parents. I think also over the past few years, Me Too has continued to really shine a light on the really widespread sexual harassment that women face at work and the kind of everyday sexism that they experience in the streets, you know, in terms of harassment, sexist comments, catcalling and so on. I mean, in terms of Donald Trump, at least 20 women have now accused him of sexual assault. And he just continues to show how much he does not understand the concept, really. You know, one of the recent accusations against him, he's denied the claim on the basis that he wouldn't have assaulted this woman because she's not his type. You know, like, this is really what sexual assault is about. It's about you fancy someone. You know, so I think it reminds us that Me Too is such an important ongoing process of recognition of the effects of harassment and assault on women, and how much it really does shape lots of people's experience in different ways, and is something that often people haven't felt able to talk about and now do feel able to talk about. And this is an entirely positive change, I think, that can help to add in to a picture of how we might challenge sexism. And I think the thing that really ties all of these different aspects I'm talking about together does come back to women's assumed role in society as primary caregivers, you know, as the child rearers, the carers for other family members, you know, the people who will do all of that for free out of love in the household, and they'll continue to do that even when it's difficult, you know, even when there's immense pressure on them, and so on. You know, and I think it's important to make it clear that that I think that that expectation on women shapes all of us, whether or not we actually have children and whether or not we actually live in a kind of nuclear family setup. I think it shapes the expectations around women and the way that they're treated. And it explains a lot of these things in different ways, doesn't it? It helps to explain why women get paid less, you know, as through a combination of having to do part-time work or take breaks from working because you have children, alongside the undervaluing of jobs that women tend to do, you know, caring, which of course clearly should be treated as an unimportant role that doesn't deserve much pay because women would do it anyway because we're naturally caring. You know, these kind of things all add up to the pay gap. It relates, of course, most clearly to why austerity hits women, precisely because of every cut to a service, every benefit change, you know, piles responsibility back onto individuals in the home. It also relates, though, I think, to why Me Too is necessary, to, you know, to why there is that kind of sexism and the sexist attitudes towards women that lead to, you know, the kind of catcalling and so on. You know, this expectation that women's primary goal is to find a man, have children, you know, keep the man so you can afford to live, care for everyone, make everyone else feel better, comfort everyone else all the time, you know, make sure that you're smiling so everyone else feels comfortable, make sure that you're making the tea so they don't get thirsty. You know, all of these things which you kind of unconsciously sometimes carry out that role yourself, but also that other people often unconsciously expect you to carry out. I think it shapes the particular, you know, the kind of vicious misogyny that trans women face at the moment. This constant, because it's an extension of the scrutiny that all women face. Are they performing their role properly? Do they look right? Are they feminine enough? Are they trying too hard? You know, are they not fitting into the stereotype, or are they fitting into it too much? You know, and the same goes, I think, for women who are considered too butch, for women who are considered, you know, not feminine enough and so on. Or for lesbians who somehow are expected to be there, you know, to perform on behalf of other people, you know, like the women on the bus who faced that horrendous attack in London recently. And no one is safe for this. No woman is safe from this, really, or girl. You know, no one can really meet those demands fully, partly because they're constantly shifting as well. You know, the precise expectations. There was this scary article I read the other day about the Kardashians. They're bringing corsets back and extreme makeup and nails and all of this stuff. And the kind of get-up that really you can't function in any kind of normal way if you're wearing it, you know, or if your nails are that long. And, you know, if you actually have to go to work, it's quite difficult to meet these kind of extreme ideas of how you should look. There was like a leaked video from a photo shoot that Kim Kardashian was doing recently, where she was asked to sit on a chair, and she was like, "Well, I can't sit," like because her corset was so tight, it actually precluded her being able to sit down. She had to hover over the chair. At an awards ceremony recently, an actress, Elle Fanning, young woman, fainted and fell off her chair because her vintage corseted dress was so tight that she actually didn't have enough air. You know, this is like going back to a Victorian kind of ideal. This is a painting called Madame X. Of a Parisian socialite who apparently she got the alabaster skin by painting all her exposed skin with enamel so that it was smooth, and then she would paint on tiny blue veins with a tiny little paintbrush. But it was literally her job to look nice and go to functions. You know, she was married to a wealthy person and so on. You know, so it's kind of this combination of an idea around the standards of beauty and being rich enough to not have to go to work. But the problem is that these kind of expectations, or the kind of, you know, Instagrammable Kardashian-style looks, they filter down to ordinary women, to girls who feel like they're trying to meet them, even though they can't possibly ever do that. I think that this expectation about women also feeds into this idea that we should be nice, you know, and that takes us back to Marcia Jones at the beginning, really. It's like she was judged for not being nice. It's like she was judged for starting an argument, and that's not something ladies should do, and certainly not pregnant ones. You know, they shouldn't be loud, they shouldn't fight. Their priority should be their family. Their priority should be acting in an appropriate manner. And women who don't follow that path should be made to feel guilty, you know, selfish, for prioritising their own needs, or, you know, whatever it is, all these kind of things that get shown. And of course, you know, for women who don't have children, there's often all kinds of assumptions made about them. Firstly, that it was a choice, when of course one of the other effects of austerity and the cutbacks in the NHS in this country is that IVF availability is getting more and more difficult, and the waiting list getting longer for a procedure that is obviously very time sensitive. You know, this is so at all ends of the scale that relate to women's expected role around the family, things are being made more difficult. And at each level, women are made to feel like they're the one who have failed. You know, somehow their body has failed to meet the expectations that are put upon them. And of course, the family and the household is also the place where the most violence and abuse actually takes place, you know, in terms of women who are killed by partners or ex-partners, you know, in terms of child abuse and so on. It's within the family, it's within private homes. And partly, of course, it's a complex issue which I'm not really talking about, but partly it is about precisely about it being behind closed doors, isn't it? It's about the way that the family is so privatised and so kind of cut off, like it's nobody else's business what happens once you get home. And of course, not just violence and sexual abuse and so on, but the kind of controlling behaviour that has more recently been recognised in the law. So I think that really, in our society, is the root of where women's oppression comes from. It's not biological. You know, it's not because women are the weaker sex, or they've got female brains, or they can have children. You know, women have always had children. They've not always been oppressed in this way. It's not always been the case that reproduction is something that is hived off as this separate job that takes place that women are responsible for over in a corner somewhere while men get on with, you know, working and so on. You know, there are still societies today which, you know, organise themselves in very different ways. In southwest China, there's a society where that is still organised matrilineally, you know, as in wealth passes through the female line. Because there's no monogamy, so women don't necessarily know who the father of their child is, so you can't really do inheritance that way. And actually there isn't a word for father precisely because there isn't monogamy, but men have responsibilities as uncles. You know, they're responsible for their sisters' children. You know, so there are all kinds of caring responsibilities which are shared between men and women, but in a very different way from our society. I'm not necessarily advocating that as an alternative, but I think the point is that humans have organised themselves in lots of different ways throughout history, and we should never accept this notion that the way we live now or the way we behave now is somehow natural and is biological and is the way it's always been, because really it's quite recent. I think it's important to say that when we're criticising the nuclear family in this way, we're not rejecting the idea of people having relationships or raising their own children. You know, this was something that came up during the Russian Revolution, when people like Alexandra Kollontai, who was one of the leading Bolsheviks who was trying to implement family policies that could help to take the burden off individual women and to socialise a lot of the caring responsibilities and so on. And some women were like, why are you trying to take our children away and put them in collective nurseries? And she was like, this is not what we're doing. You know, what they were trying to do is separate out the economic necessity of life, you know, all of those material necessities, from the choices that we should be making about who we live with and how we live and how we raise our children and so on. And that's the key, really. One of the interesting things that Lynn Marie from the Glasgow strike said, I remember at one of the meetings I've been at where she's spoken, was that when they won their dispute and they were told they were going to get these big payouts, that would be thousands of pounds each, and she said lots of women were phoning her up saying, oh, will it be enough to buy a new sofa? Will it be enough to go on holiday? And one of them phoned her up and was like, will it be enough to leave my husband? And they both laughed. But it was kind of serious as well, because the reality is, even in perfectly decent relationships, there's still a sense that if you didn't actually have to live with someone else in order to be able to afford the rent or the mortgage, then maybe you wouldn't. But it's very hard to know that, because most of us can't possibly afford to live completely independently, particularly in and I think that for us, the responsibility for raising children, for caring for ill people or the elderly and so on, all kinds of caring responsibilities should be with the whole community to resolve, with a kind of, much more than just a safety net actually, but proper provision of all of those services which allow people to come in and out when they need them. So the nuclear family in our society is held up as this ideal: the father, the mother, the 3 kids, or more than 3 kids, I should say, if you're in Hungary, where Viktor Orban is offering tax breaks for life, discounted cars, interest-free loans, subsidised housing to any woman who has 4 kids or more, as long as they look like this, I should say, and aren't migrants and aren't, any kind of troublesome people like that. This is an advert for a consultation they were doing about families, by the way, but this is the kind of image they're trying to promote. But those kind of right-wing politicians who talk about the family a lot actually destroy people's lives. They destroy children's lives. They destroy lots of things through the cuts that we've already talked about, but also things like the hostile environment in Britain, which tears apart migrant families, which rips people out of their communities and their lives and sends them back to somewhere they've never been or that they left 50 or 60 years ago in the case of some of these Windrush generation. Or the similar policy, of course, in the Mexican border. And one picture that I will not be using, because I find it too upsetting, is of the Oscar Ramirez and his 2-year-old daughter, Angie, who were drowned in the river trying to cross into the US recently. Really killed by the zero-tolerance approach that Trump instituted, even though it was officially overturned months ago, but in practice is still shaping what is happening at the border there. And that tells us really something about how much the Trumps of this world really care about family in terms of real human beings. For them, it's nothing to do, or for him, it's nothing to do with morality. It's about ideological control, and it's about, telling us what we should be doing, with our own bodies and all the rest of it. And that's a point I'll come back to. But firstly, I just wanted to look at the question of women in high places, because when I talk about the hostile environment, I mean, who created that? A woman, Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary and continuing this as Prime Minister. Is this the answer, women in high places? And I think for some people, of course, they do celebrate this kind of, a particular kind of feminism that celebrates capitalism. Christine Lagarde, formerly of the IMF, now about to take up a role heading the European Central Bank. I should point out, before I criticise Christine Lagarde, the first story I read about her getting this new job, in the first sentence, this was on the BBC, she was described as poised and chic Christine Lagarde. So it's just a reminder that sexism, no woman is immune from it, however powerful and wealthy and high up in the system. There's still all of this loaded, ideology. But her idea of the kind of change that we need is, wouldn't it be great if there were more women at the top, that banks would be more stable if there were more women on the boards, presumably because we have less testosterone or whatever it is, and are less competitive and all of this kind of, this idea. Sheryl Sandberg, similarly, Yahoo, Facebook woman. Her vision is 50% of companies and states should be run by women, and that's it, really. So what they're talking about is equal opportunity exploitation, a continuation of the kind of exploitative and unequal and unjust society that we live in, but with a few more women running it. And I think, of course, I hope, it should be clear to all of us in this room that for the vast majority of women, nothing really would change. And for most men, of course, as well. Having more women at the top doesn't actually do anything to change the kind of, the material and the ideological role that the family still plays, such an important role in a capitalist society. And even for rich women at the top of society who can alleviate the burden that most women face, who can pay for lots of nannies and staff and all the rest of it so that they're not struggling to do their job and look after their family, you know, it's still, the burden is on them to sort all of that out. It's still considered their job, even if they can afford to pay probably a migrant woman who's left her children somewhere else to come and look after their family. And I think everything that causes the stereotypes and the attitudes and all the rest of it that affect all working class women, whether or not they have children, would still remain in place. You know, that's the kind of the feminism of the Spice Girls, if you like. There was a T-shirt that went on sale recently in Britain that said it was promoting women's rights and was going to give money to charity or whatever. It said girl power on it. And it turned out it was made in a factory in Bangladesh that sacked 100 workers earlier this year for protesting at low wages. You know, something like 8,000 garment workers in Bangladesh have been sacked in the past year. Just this year. At 27 different factories for protesting over the minimum wage. And I think when you look at the history of struggles, this is the side of it that we should be looking at. These are some of the women and men from the garment factories who've been striking in Dhaka in Bangladesh in January. And it was, you know, a huge strike which shut the city down for a day. This is, I think, what we want to be looking at in terms of how to bring about some real change. And I think, just to pick one area, the fight for equal pay, I think it's very instructive when you look at where that battle has come from. It hasn't come through nice politicians thinking, oh, wouldn't it be a good idea to pass a law about equal pay? It's come from worker struggles at every single turn. You know, the call for equal pay started in the 19th century. You know, it was first put to the TUC during the New Unionism in 1888, when thousands of women and men entered the workforce, got involved in unions for the first time and started to organise, and a socialist called Clementina Black put the first motion to the TUC. A few decades later, in 1918, a successful tram and train strike led to a government inquiry into equal pay. In World War II, women going into the engineering plants while men were off at war led to strikes with women and men in those plants calling, you know, which among their demands was equal pay. And of course, people will know the battle at Ford's Dagenham. This is like one favourite picture in the world, really. This is one of the mass meetings where the women at Ford's Dagenham in 1968 voted to go on strike, you know, in a battle which led to the Equal Pay Act of 1970. And actually it was a strike at a windscreen wiper factory, Trico, in a couple of years later in 1970, which really was the first battle to make sure that the Equal Pay Act was actually implemented, because as soon as it was passed, the employers start to find ways that they can circumvent it and get around it and trick it. And that's exactly what the women in Glasgow, of course, were dealing with now. You know, these tricksy ways of, you know, managing to pay women less without it being officially about them being women. You know, more recently, of course, we've seen all kinds of struggles. This is Sudan, you know, a struggle which, you know, is yet unresolved, isn't it? We don't know what was going to happen next in the Sudanese revolution, but we do know that one of the major factors of it is the way that women have been at the forefront of those battles. You know, who are the world leaders today that people are looking to, really, that are actually making a change? It's teenage girls on the school strikes and so on. You know, this is something about, it's not just a coincidence, I think, it's something about the way that, you know, when people strike back against the system, or, you know, when they protest and they march and they say enough is enough, they're challenging more than just whatever the specific issue is. They're challenging their role in society, they're challenging the expectations that people have. And I think that fighting for dignity, for respect and all of those things is absolutely at the heart of all of those struggles that have taken place. I think, you know, for capitalism can live with abortion rights and it can live without them. You know, for them it's kind of technical question of what they can get away with. You know, the same goes for equal pay, of course, and they'll always manage to try and get around that. For us, fighting for abortion rights, or, you know, or any of these other things, is about liberation. It's about steps towards liberation. Now, liberation is not an easy thing to define. I think firstly it means more than just equality within a society that treats most people like crap. You know, that's number one. It's about wanting a completely different kind of society that is based on cooperation and democracy and on, you know, cooperation and respect really between all people. And crucially, a society that is built through the struggles of the exploited and the oppressed, who feel themselves change in that process really. I think, you know, this is something that we saw happen, you know, briefly, because again, the Egyptian revolution has been rolled back since 2011, but this is Tahrir Square, where the occupation was in 2011, when they toppled the 30-year dictator Mubarak. And really, some of the quotes from people who were involved at Tahrir Square really express something about what liberation might mean and what, you know, what changes can come about when people are involved in trying to shape the world around them. So a woman called Mona Saif said about Tahrir Square in 2011, "I've never felt as at peace and as safe as I did during those days in Tahrir. There was a sense of coexistence that overcame all of the problems that usually happen, whether religious or gender-based. Pre-January the 25th, which is the day when Mubarak was toppled, whenever we would attend protests, I would always be told by the men to go to the back to avoid getting injured, and that used to anger me. But since 25th of January, people have begun to treat me as an equal. There was this unspoken admiration for one another in the square." You know, and I think it goes further than that as well, doesn't it, in terms of, you know, everyone that is involved in the revolution and how it changes people. One brilliant expression of this was in Spain, actually, in 1937, in Barcelona, where someone who was involved there in the revolution against the fascist Franco said it wasn't a question of waiting for a superior to give an order, for instructions to come from an officer or political leader. No, everything came from the people. All the qualities and capabilities which capitalism prevents from developing were suddenly revealed by the revolution. Peasants who'd never listened to music listened to concerts in an impressive silence, or to the great poets. The immense strength of the people, their courage, fraternity, comradeship, appeared with overwhelming force. You know, and I think it's important to say that women's liberation is only, you know, it can't be separated off. It's part of a bigger picture, and it's a fantastically central part of that. But it has to be intimately connected to the liberation of all humanity. And I want to end with a quote with this woman, Alexandra Kollontai, who's in the middle there. This was during the Russian Revolution, shortly afterwards, 1920, I think. There was a Congress of the Peoples of the East, you know, the eastern parts of the former Russian Empire, where Kollontai went to organise among some of the Muslim women and women of different, you know, languages and communities around the eastern parts of the empire, and to talk about what their needs were really in terms of what to prioritise in the revolution. And she talked as well, I mean, Kollontai wrote a lot about sexuality, about relationships and how they could change. But her key point, I think, is a really nice one to end on, because she talks about how we can't even know how much relationships can change between people. You know, it's like very difficult for us in this society to understand how big a leap there could be when you're talking about changing to a society that's genuinely based on participation of everybody in the decision making and all the rest of it. And this is what she says. There's no doubt that in the accomplished communist society, love, winged eros, will be transformed into something completely unfathomable to us. What will this new transformed eros be? The boldest fantasy is unable to capture its form.